Hi, welcome everybody. Welcome to the latest CTO Craft Bytes. Today, we will look at how design thinking can solve your challenges. If this is your first time at CTO Craft Bytes, let me tell you a little bit more about this group. CTO Craft is a mentoring and coaching community for technology leaders around the world, focusing on supporting technologists in their leadership growth. The community members are over 7,000, and CTO Craft provides them with one-on-one coaching, mentoring groups, a curated Slack community, and events like this one. If you're not a member of the CTO Craft community and you're interested in becoming one, or you'd like to get updates on these events on emails, I've posted some links in the chat to help you do that. Let it go through. And there you go. I'm going to post them in a second because I just got a message that the message is too long. So I'm going to split them into a few in a second. And in the meantime, a huge thanks to our headline partner, AWS, for helping make these Bytes events possible. I'm Alexander Korzyński. I'm a DevOps consultant through TopTel, currently contracting to Priceline.com. And joining me today is Elin, head of design at Softwire. Can you tell us a bit about yourself, Elin? Oh, we can't hear you right now. Maybe you're on mute.
Here we go. It's the mute time again. Thank you for having me. I'm Elin Sjursen. I'm Norwegian. I have been here in London for 16 years, I think, and have been working in various design agencies and consultancy through all of that time, having had various titles like interaction designer, user researcher, service designer, UX lead to head of positions like this. And I've just, my sort of interest in design stems from when I was quite young, actually, thinking about how we interact with each other, really. I did a degree at the University of Bergen called Humanistic Informatics, which came just at the time when people started using their computers more, or actually getting computers, I should say. And the internet was a really fascinating place to be. So my interest in design has been from that point of angle. How do we communicate and how do we interact with each other as human beings in the different various things that we need to do day to day? So that's a bit about me.
Excellent. Thank you, Elin. Andreas, you're the head of design strategy at Visa. Can you tell us a bit about yourself as well?
Sure. As you said, I'm Andreas. I used to work with Elin. That's how we know each other. And recently stepped into a role in Visa where I'm setting up a design strategy function. So that's very, very exciting. Before then, it was big tech, consultancy, some startup, a bit of my own thing also. Very fascinated by all things like how do we deliberately design behavior and how do we create things that are actually live up to the promise of the internet, if that makes any sense. So I think it's very similar to Elin's line there along like, it's very fascinating why people do the stuff that they do and how can we build things that are really good for them. That's a little bit about my background. I'm also Swedish, not also because Elin was from Norway. But, so it's that kind of combo that worked really well.
Interesting. All right. So we have humanistic computing, and we have making the best out of the internet, having the internet live at its promise. So that's great. So let's talk about how design thinking can solve your challenges, or can it really? So let's talk a little bit about design. What is design really to organizations and businesses? Elin, would you like to start?
Yeah, I think it's actually quite interesting how people see what design is, what kind of perspectives they come at it from. A lot of times I feel that people think of design, particularly digital design, as being user experience, about being visual design, about being how do you get the pixels on the screen to do the things you want them to do. Whereas I think design is quite a lot broader than that. It's about problem solving. It is about thinking about bigger things, like how do you make a person carry out certain tasks? How do you create value propositions that are going to be interesting for your target audience? So there's a big challenge within that. How do you design the different components, not necessarily the actions on the screen, but what is it that people are going to buy into about your experience that is compelling enough for them to be loyal users and loyal clients? And I feel that sometimes we're thinking a little bit too granularly about what design really is. It's not just what's on the screen. It's about the system thinking. It's about the experience behind what happens on the screen.
All right, system thinking and experience. So broader than what we usually think about design. Andreas, do you have anything to add to this?
No, I think it's super interesting what Elin says, and I agree with that. I think the way I think of it too is like that design maturity scale of like going from very tactical and executional. I'm not saying that's bad. It's just more like make my thing pretty to like, okay, wow, you can help the business. Oh, wow, you can transform the business. Oh, okay, wow, design behaviors in like corporate strategy makes a giant difference on how we plan our entire business. I think it's like that kind of, I think historically maybe, unfortunately, fortunate and unfortunate, we've been more on the like the less mature side as design in general, but you see in businesses now it's moving this side, and I think this part is super interesting. So yeah, I think that's the kind of the area that I'm very interested in, and maybe I say that because I'm really bad at anything when it relates to like Figma or Sketch or anything like that. So it's self-serving, but it's interesting to think about like how do we infuse design behaviors, design mindsets into a business. So, and I think I agree with Elin too. I think it's like creative problem solving is basically what it's about, and then people use different tools for that. But yeah, very aligned with that.
And I think just to add to that, I think that's where businesses sometimes can have a challenge with how to use design in their organizations, because if you're coming at it from the point of view that you just need a visual designer or a user experience person to come in and crank out a few journeys that does what you want it to do, you're not really designing, are you? What you have to sort of realize is that if you want to solve your business problems, there is a lot of thinking, there is a lot of strategy that goes into design, and it's not solved by a one person on their own in a team doing a little bit of visual design and making your artifacts real. It is a real team effort. So I feel that sometimes that the higher level design thinking is missing from what the common sort of mass thinking is around what design is for them.
Got it. So what I'm taking out of this is design and business strategy and the interaction between those two, and the sort of big picture thinking. So before we get into these subjects, can we just define what does digital mean in design? How does digital design differ from design in general?
Yeah, I guess I can start, but I think, I mean, to be honest, it's one of those things that, I mean, it's pretty straightforward, or it's very complicated. I mean, digital is building things for digital channels, but you can also argue that actually, like, that separation, I mean, it's of course important for the people who are doing the work. It's very different to build a physical product than to build a digital interface. That's different. Principles might be the same, but the executions are very different. So I would say, but I also think it's like, in a way, you're building always around human needs. So what are those needs? Then digital is a channel to execute in, but that could also be, can be physical. But then there's also a bridge, because like, take a payment experience today, you build a digital interface, but actually something happens in the physical world. Like it's all very connected. I say that knowing that I would have no chance in designing physical product. So there is that.
I think that there is a big challenge in this, because obviously digital design happens on the screen, but it's not to say that how people experience it doesn't move from channel to channel. So for instance, if a bank wants to create a really good experience for their consumers, they need to think about the things that you're allowed to do while you're using digital tools, apps or websites or whatever it is, and how that that kind of journey continues if you then are in a branch talking to a person, because often there is a big disconnect. You do something online and then you meet someone in person and they have no idea, and those two experiences don't connect. And I think that's a real challenge that has been highlighted for quite a few years, but yet we're still not at a place where these types of design merges up quite well. And partly I think that has to do with design silos. So you can design a customer experience that is physical, but you have a team working on that on their own with different objects or objectives than maybe what the digital team has, who sits somewhere else under someone else's leadership, and then those two things don't necessarily meet.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. So you just talked about challenges. So can you tell us, how does design thinking help resolve these challenges?
Oh, it's such a big question, isn't it? Because can it? And I feel that in the last few years, there's a lot of talk about design thinking and how it's going to be this magic process that's just going to solve all your problems. And then when it doesn't, you're quite disappointed and you tend to think it's not working. It's not for us. We don't need these fancy designers. This is just, not going to work. But I tend to see it as design often have two phases. One is when you need to understand the bigger picture around an experience. Maybe you're still in a stage where you're defining what this experience should be. Maybe there are features you want to be exploring and understand how to best deliver, versus when you get into the delivery of something where you're thinking about, I have this tool working, but it's not optimal, so I need to change certain things about how the journey flows or how that interaction works. And then there is a whole different process in place for that. Design thinking is really useful for big questions and things you have little knowledge about. So things you want to have more insight into. And for that reason, there is often a big research component to design thinking, where a team goes out to understand how your end users think and feel about a challenge they have in their life. So not really about your product, but coming back to, for instance, banking. How do people feel about money? How do they feel about how money solves the problem in their life? And then come at it from that kind of big question. What do you do? How do you save? How do you spend? How do you share money? And that opens up for so many more discussions around what people go through on a day-to-day basis than just going straight into a particular, I need to make this app do X, Y, and Z. So design thinking is useful for thinking big and thinking about concepts and thinking about new ways of delivering services to audiences.
Andreas, do you also think that design thinking is primarily for big questions?
I think it fits really well for big questions. So I'm not going to fight Elin to the death on that one for sure. No, but I think it definitely does. But I think it's great for messy problems that are non-binary. And when I'm saying non-binary, I mean there isn't like a 0 or 1 answer. It's not like this code works or it doesn't. I know that's not even true either. That, but you see my point. So like when it's like soft problem, human problems basically. So for that, I think it works really, really well. I think when I see it working horribly wrong is when people think it's like a silver bullet process that if you just follow all the steps, you will be fine, because usually that's not true. And usually people who do that say, oh, I tried this thing, design thinking, and it doesn't work. And I would argue that today design thinking is common sense. And I say that because the opposite of it is stupid. And what I mean is, if you think about knowing, like understanding your users or empathizing with your users or understanding them, the opposite of that is to not understand your users. That's not great. So you should obviously do that. Then like defining a good question and a really interesting challenge. The opposite of that is having a very boring challenge. Not great. So I think of strategy like, if the opposite of your strategy is stupid, it's not a strategy. So I think it connects to this. So what I mean is like, you need to add your own common sense to it too, to be like, okay, how do we understand these users? I mean, and every time you do the kind of understanding phase, I think you almost always like invent a slightly different way of doing it, if that makes sense. So it could be anything from an interview to observation to sitting in someone's living room, or asking them to do something and then just asking them questions about that. It could be getting video diaries. It could be anything. But it could also sometimes, depending on what you do, it's like, I don't know how to phrase that, but like there's also stories that people tell ourselves about why we do the things that we do when we don't understand why we do what we do. So I think it's like you need to like understand that almost, which I know is a little bit confusing because it is. But generally, I agree that I think it's about the mindset more than that like, hey, here is those steps. I think the reason why design thinking is very popular is because it is consumable as a process. But I think that's also like where it kind of goes wrong at times. And I say that knowing that the way that I got into this myself was very much through like a process. And for a few years, I was like, oh, but I'll just follow this slide deck and then it will be fine. And then you realize like, oh, yeah, actually. And I had one of those like aha moments. I was lucky to get to go over to Stanford to talk to someone in the D school, and I was like, oh well, what's your design thinking deck? And they just looked at me and were like, what do you mean? Like I have a flip chart. I was like, what? Yeah, and then they like talked me through the mindsets of each stage. I was like, oh yeah, okay. But I think that's also how learning works, right? Like you start with something very structured, and then you kind of internalize it, and then you make it your own. And then you like kind of create your own expression of it based off of the mindsets in a way, right? And also if you're managing teams in this area and in kind of that kind of creative ambiguity, I think that's really important to think about too. Is like, instead of telling them, oh, do exactly these steps, you'd be like, okay, the idea is that I want you to like understand humans. What are you going to do? And then the question that you could ask, you can like coach them through it without telling them exactly what to do, because that generally they have better ideas than any of us. So it's a better thing to like give that responsibility to the people who are close to the work, if that makes sense. So yeah.
And another thing I think is important to mention here is that your business objectives and the business models behind the experience that you create is not a separate thing. So if you're going to have a team designing something that is going to work for the end users, doing this in isolation with you inputting onto what the business model is, and actually work with them to maybe refine how the business model work. That's when design thinking really works, that you can take the insight that the team goes through in that first discovery phase of things to understand what we thought about how this business model, how it can actually achieve the things that we want it to do might not work, because the research says that people need different types of tools, so they have different goals. How do we then change and pivot, and how do we create something that actually is solving their problem while meeting our business needs? So these two things need to be together, and to me very often that's where a disconnect happens again, is that we don't have the right people in the room. It's not just about getting designers on their own, but building that bigger business team into the group that design the actual experiences.
And I think just one thing I want to add to that too is I think that's critical to get the right people in the room and to make sure that it's cross-functional, because as much as design is too important to be left for designers, business is too important to be left to business people. So I think it's like each side of it needs to come closer and like both kind of respect each other, which they always do, of course, and also just like, you know, get like that diverse set of perspectives in, because that really, really helps. I think one thing that I think a lot about now is like, how do we keep it as close to real as possible? And how are the exercises based on the mindset? How do we design like what that looks like? So one example could be, you know, you can take people through an exercise where you actually give them money to say, okay, you're buying a feature in this product, like which one would you want to pay for? And because it's like, people answer differently when you ask them to like make decisions with money or with in real life, if you can. So if there's any way you can get it to as close to real as possible when you test and do that really early, that's like very good.
So how do you keep that conversation going? So you mentioned inviting the business people into the room. How do you maintain that relationship for the long term so that designers in the business room or business people in the designers room, how do you structure that relationship?
I think it's a really challenging question, because I think you're pointing to where things don't really hand over quite well, because you might start with a team that is doing the early analysis of how something needs to work and design the core bones around this experience. And I have very often been in teams that have done initial research, have had big workshops with key stakeholders within an organization. And we've all come to an understanding that these are the core journeys we want to focus on. This is where the meat is going to happen. Let's mock this up. Let's test it. And so we do that. It works really well. We decide that, yep, this is a compelling enough value proposition. We should go for this. And then the team then designs the artifacts that the clients or in-house teams take away to get further budgets and start working on things. But the team that picks up is often a very different team. So then there are new people onto the team. They might not be quite bought into what's going on with the propositions, and things start falling apart. So one way of stopping that from happening is to really try to understand your entire end-to-end process, from doing something from scratch, from trying to innovate around the service, to trying to create a new product, to how that feeds into the existing pipeline of product and services that you have, and make sure that someone is following that chain from end to end and has the knowledge, and that the right kind of documentation is placed for people to pick up and get going. And I think Andreas might have some really interesting points of view on this.
Yeah, no, I agree with this, and I think it's like, but I think it's like also, I mean, in a way, it's like a super difficult question, because in a way, what you're saying is like, how do you build valuable relationships? And it's like, yeah, but if people knew that, they would have brilliant lives always, all the time, right? So I think there's no easy answer, but what I would say is like, there's a couple of things that I think about a lot, which is like authenticity. Like, how do I, like, if it is bad and I think it's bad, I should say that too. No, I don't mean that in a like detrimental way, but I just mean like sometimes we forget that, like, we're not trying to protect anything, but it's like you just need to be authentic with what the challenge is, if that makes sense. It's like it's easy to try to get someone in to say, oh, but just come for this one thing, or you could be like, actually, if you come for the 3 days, you can do 3 days with me, or we can do 90 half-hour meetings, and they're approximately the same amount of time. So I prefer the 3 days because you're going to get the results quicker. And then most people go, yeah, you know what? I prefer that versus 90 half-hour meetings. 90 half-hour meetings is not that same amount of time, but still. So I think it's like, how do you set the right expectations? How do you bring people in? And how do you also make it kind of interesting and exciting and a bit fun, to be honest? I think that's like a piece that is very important, because like, just because it's business and work, I mean, there's lots of research on how humor and fun increases tasks management and task productivity, basically. So I think of it like that. Like, how do you make people want to be there? How do you make people see that it's like it drives that important business goal? I think there's always at the first time where you try to bring someone in, there's always an element of trust from their end, right? Because you have an idea of what they're going to go through, and if you're running that, but they don't. So they might go like, oh, okay, this is going to be as awful as all the other workshops I've been to in my life. Because there's a lot of like workshops and sprints that are pretty like, not that exciting and not that fun and doesn't really go anywhere. So it's more like, how do they believe in you, and how do you ask for that permission to be like, I'm going to spend 2 days with you. If you hate this at the end of it, let's talk. But right now, let's just like bear with me, and I will almost promise you that you'll be excited at the end of this. And then most of the times that work. And if it doesn't, you can always go have a feedback session, understand why, and then change it for the next time. And then, so I think it's like, that's what I think about a lot. And I think the thing that I do think about is like deliberately designing behavior. So what is the behavior that we need to see, or mindset's behavior, and how do we set it up in a way that can actually happen? Not prescriptively pushing people in any direction, but I'll give an example. But if I want people to be expansive, for instance, that's more the mindset. Then it's like, how do I set that session up in order to make sure that happens, or get us as close to that as possible? I think it's also interesting sometimes where in previous lives you can see some stakeholders might have different incentives, and then we're surprised that they're not like getting along, and you're like, well, it's because if you win, you fail. Like, well, of course you don't get along. Of course this would never work. So I think it's also about being a bit quite practical. Like many years ago, I worked with a company who shall be unknown, and I had a conversation with the CMO, and they were having challenges, and I said, okay, well, let's look at your online piece, right, your presence, and I pointed out that, here, if you put the phone number here, then people cannot call you, or they can contact you via this button here, and it's a bit of like that's online strategy part, and he says, no, I can't do that. It's like, okay, yeah, because the person who owns the call center, that's a separate budget from him. So if he puts that online, they're going to call that call center, and then his numbers will go up, but I won't get it through my online form, which is my numbers. You see, like, so you wonder then why experiences are so like fragmented and strange as a consumer. It's because they have different incentives, and if you change those incentives, that behavior will change. So in a way, it's like funny, because it's like design 101. It's like you change the user interface, and behaviors will change. So that also goes for how we structure our approaches and thinking. And like, if I ask someone to come in and listen to my really sad PowerPoint 50 slides, they're gonna act like they've just seen a really sad 50-page PowerPoint, and that's usually never conducive for what I need to do. So I think it's like being really mindful of like, what space do you take? What do you fill it with? What do you bring into the room? How does what you bring in connect to other ecosystems, to the point of ecosystems before? And how do you think of it like end to end? So yeah, it's a long way.
Let me ask you then.
Can I say something quickly? Because I have something on that. I think it's so important what you're saying about creating the environments for things to happen. And I feel that here is often a big challenge for companies that want to innovate around things. They often create these little silos where you have a bunch of people who are responsible for innovation, but it's very hard for them to take something and make it real because they're so separate from the rest of the organization. And I think very often when you think about who has great ideas, it is the people who actually work within their entire company and know the problems on their skin and souls, and allowing them to find a safe way of putting ideas, however stupid they might sound, and trying them, and then setting up some criteria for how you prioritize the best ones. And here is the bigger challenge I find is that hierarchies are really damaging to innovation, because very often there is a person on the top who says, I need this type of product now because I'm going to speak at some event and I want to make this big announcement, and so this needs to happen. Or there's some completely other rationale for this one thing that they really desperately want. But the people who work for this person might not be bought into that, or it might not be what the company actually needs, because that person isn't that connected to what happens on the ground. So creating an environment where everyone can bring in these ideas, regardless of what their role are, and creating a really kind of thorough process for how you prioritize and validate the ideas, so that the best ones are the ones that move forward, and not based on hierarchy or bad decision making. So I think that's another thing that is a bit of a challenge for most organizations, to get that space right, the safe space for people to come up with things, and the time to try out things without necessarily it becoming something immediately, and then the process to prioritize the outcomes or strike them off the list as it is.
Right. So being a part of an agency and being outside of that hierarchy, does that help? Or can it be also a challenge, especially if you want to follow up? We're talking about follow up after the initial designs, after initial ideas. How would you structure this relationship between an agency and a client?
Yeah, oh my goodness. It's a challenging question, because obviously in an agency, you don't own the end experience. You are there to help your stakeholders and clients build the best possible experiences possible. So you might not be able to follow from the initial designs to delivery to iteration. Sometimes you are, and you build these relationships where you are very deep into the actual hands-on delivery of something, and you build a relationship with the key stakeholders on the ground. And when I say stakeholders, I don't just mean the people in the C-suite, but also people who are carrying out the work, design colleagues, and from there on help them influence upwards. And I think that is maybe the best thing that you can do, is to help the teams influence upwards, to show them why something might not be a good idea, to show them how certain prioritization are going to have outcomes that you might not want them to have. So really helping your team influence upwards, I think is the key thing to do that.
Andreas, what do you think? How can Elin help you, given that you're on an in-house team, Elin is in an agency? How would you benefit from the help of an agency?
Well, I just like working with Elin. No, well, I do, but that's not the real reason. I think there's a couple of things that are interesting / challenging, and good. I think when an agency is used to what it's intended to do in my world, which is like perspective, ideally like a new fresh perspective, and also at times specialist skills, And also at times augmentation, but that depends on the type of company. Like if I need someone to do a specific job, but I need to do it for a long time, then maybe I should hire them. But that depends on the setup. It depends on how people are structured their businesses. I think I'm in a lucky position that we have a lot of the skills that we need. But there's also times where it's important to not forget that there is really good skills that's on the market that you can get in for a specific piece of job. I think the challenge at times is that it's this is my first role as the client in a way. I've always been more on the kind of agency consultancy side before, and being a client is actually, it's quite difficult. And you can see that also with some agencies that you might have worked with, that you kind of like, are you getting, how does that relationship work? Because in a way, it's at times a bit can be imbalanced. What I mean is, like, if I'm the client, I'm the one who decides that contract will finish or not. So, how easy is it to challenge your client? Not very. And that's a problem if the client isn't necessarily asking for what they need. So people tend to know what they want, but not always what they need. And I think sometimes that's a challenge in the agency-client relationship. Sometimes, but then there's people that's not a challenge with. But I think it's also, what I'm trying to get to is that the client competency, to have competency as a client is difficult. And it changes. And it's difficult for people to constantly develop and grow, so they're constantly like know what is the latest way of doing this, for instance, without actually knowing how to do everything. So I say that because there's been times where in previous lives where people showed you cases and things, and they didn't know anything about you or your experience. So they basically say something about AI and machine learning, and then you start asking a few follow-up questions, and you realize, like, okay, you actually don't know anything about this. This is just a cool looking case study that you put together that you thought that I would look at and go, oh my God, that's amazing. Whereas, like, so I think it's like not, yeah, it's like, yeah, I think it's important to just kind of be a bit authentic and humble with what you bring, and also like know that clients can know a lot of stuff at times, or not really. It depends, right? Depends on topic too. I've been going on. I'll be quiet there.
Andreas, so behind you, I can see actually it says, protect me from what I want. So is that what you're referring to, right?
Yeah, a bit, because like it's easy for you to come in and be like, oh, this is what I want to do, and this is how I think everything should be. But if I know that already, I just need augmentation, and like paying people for augmentation. Yeah, you can do that, and that has its time and its place. But a lot of times what I want is like, show me a different way, show me a perspective that you think, show me a smarter way of doing this. So, and I think, but this is more related to like human behavior and irrationality too, because that's a whole other ballgame. But it's interesting in design also, I think.
I think in the end, we're all humans and we all thrive on relationships. And I think I've been working in-house as well, obviously, together with Andreas. And in my experience, we also treat our own stakeholders almost a bit like clients. And when you work in-house, you do have an end goal. You do have people that you have to satisfy, just as if you are in an agency, you want to satisfy your clients and do the right thing for your clients. But in that, there is an honest, deep connection and relationship that you have an opportunity to develop. And if you take that opportunity and you create that relationship that is based on trust, you can talk to your clients, you can tell them, I believe that if we change the approach, or I believe that this might not get us where we want to get, there will be a dialogue and there will be discussions. And sometimes you can realize that actually I misunderstood this assignment. It isn't like that. Actually, we should be doing it this way. So it's a two-way street. It's not about going into a client feeling that you have to change their approach so that they always will know less because you are the design authority. It is a relationship that is very much based on conversation and trust and kicking ideas and being best friends, really, in the mission of coming up with the ultimate end result.
Makes sense. So we have a related question from the audience from Mark Batty, who's asking, is there in design thinking an element, a process, a procedure that can help find consensus between the different stakeholders?
There's plenty. Okay, depending on what type of consensus you're looking for, but and how much time you have, you can do anything from group therapy session to an affinity map where you group ideas and you vote on them. It could be super basic to super advanced, but I think it's a key thing to do get people aligned. I think one way to do it is also of aligning up front of silly exercise would be like news of the future. So this product is amazingly successful. What's the news of the future that's going to come out on your publication, and which publication, and what does the headline say? And then everybody writes their own without talking, and then you realize oh, okay, wow, you're really aligned, or you really want different things here. Let's talk about that. So I think it's there's many ways of doing that, and you can do it in a way that fits with the group. I did a project ages ago for a movie company where they were launching a film, and there was a few. They were like, "Oh, this is a new thing. This is so exciting and so new." And I just went through all everything, and it just kind of it looks really old though. So it's then you took all the new stuff that they've done in the last 10 years, you made that look really old, and you showed it to them. It's just a way for them to go, okay. Is there a metaphor for the problem that you're trying to solve that you can take people through, that they then understand it? Okay, yeah. Because it's easy for me to sit and say, yeah, the answer should be this, but that doesn't work. So what is the experience that we can take people through so they can get aligned? In a way, if it's two different departments or something, you could have that as an exercise. I'm making this up right now, but it could be get along. Let's call it get along. And in that, it's what are the reasons why you can ask people to do lists. So what are the 10 reasons why you should work together? What are the 10 reasons why you shouldn't work together? And what could you achieve together? You write that individually, and then you compare. And then you might end up being actually, this company isn't structured for us to do this. This company is structured for us to fight. And then if that's the case, that's crazy. But if that's the case, you take that to the CEO and you go, look, hello, this makes no sense. We should change this. And then they probably will. So I think it's thinking of it end to end, also internally, and being able to raise problems and fix the foundational pieces. So this actually leads a little bit to the design strategy function that I'm setting up now. I'm giving them a mandate to both work on projects, but also work on structural things. So if there is a structural thing that is not working or would work better in a different way, they should be empowered to approach that and fix that, because instead of suffering on the symptoms in each of the projects or initiatives that they work on. Because there's nothing more frustrating than to be yeah, we know this thing is broken and we know that this creates chaos, but it's not your problem to solve. It's yeah, well, if it impacts me, it's my problem to solve. So I think maybe that's the way to think about it. That was a long story about not the actual question, but you see the exercise. There was a few examples of exercises. Elin, you probably have some great ones too. But
I think that there's tons of exercises that you can do, but I think the most important thing is to again create the environment for people to align, and doing that. You need to have insights and you need to have data that these groups can align around. So for me, very often it helps having a team to go out and collect that data, collect that insight from whatever participants. It could be stakeholder interviews, it could be user interviews, all of these things, and come together, invite all the different people who needs to be aligned into a workshop where you go through exercises like the ones Andreas is mentioning around the insight, play back all the insights so everyone can start from the same common ground. We know these things. So now that we know these things, how are we going to move this forward? And then you can start design exercises and so on. And one key thing that is important in this is that people are people and they need to be given the opportunity to get along. And the way to do it is by weaving in fun little relaxing fun activities within that day. You're doing all of these other hardcore creation solutionizing experiences that is just personable, just fun to do, so people get to know each other, because as soon as people get to know each other, they are more willing to accept other people's divergent views. And that's sort of like a sneaky way, let's have a bit of fun. And a lot of people go, oh, this is a waste of time. It's like 20 minutes to draw each other silly faces or something like that. But actually, the reason why we do those activities is for people to create the personal connections that will help them take the professional decisions that they need to do.
I got it. So as we talk about conflict resolution, what about teamwork and building teams? So what's the biggest challenge in building design teams today?
Getting the right people. It's at the moment it's really hard because designers are really like hot bread. Everyone wants them. There are high salary requirements out there. Sometimes you can't compete with startups. I think so the challenge is attracting the right type of person to work with on your team. Can
you elaborate a little bit on the right kind of person? What would be the characteristics there?
I think that depends on your team itself, because we all have different flavors of how we want to do things. Some design leaders like things to be a little bit more process oriented. Others like to solve more strategic problems. So you need to think about the people you bring into this. Are they good at coping with ambiguity? Are they more hands-on delivery type people? And then you build your teams based on that. But I think that the common denominator is just looking for kind people, people who are willing to forgive, people who can let go of a argument even though they know they're right. Very often designers can be quite pig-headed. So it's a challenge to find the type of designers who can be a bit humble and say, yeah, I can see your point of view. Let's try it. Let's try it. And then rather prove their case by trying it and not actually making it work. And then they can introduce the way they thought about it originally. So there needs to be a huge amount of flexibility in their mindsets. So that's the type of people I often look for. People who know their stuff, but also know when to back off and think, in the big picture, it doesn't matter if I perceive to be wrong at this moment, because we'll come back. We'll find a way.
Andreas, what do you look for when you hire designers? Yeah, I think it's similar to what Elin says. It's like in a way it's like hire for attitude, train for skill. That old saying, right? So I think it's like finding the right mindset and the right attitude. I mean, I'm gonna be a bit boring to be like, you kind of know it when you see it, but generally I would say it's like comfortable with change, comfortable with ambiguity, and also a little bit of like, I like it. What is it? You know, like, yeah, this is interesting. What is it? What are we doing? Like somebody who can like, because I mean, it depends also on to the point that Elin mentioned, right? It depends on the context. I'm hiring design strategists, so for me, it's like in a very complex industry. And there's a lot of technical, it's very technical, and there's a lot of regulation. So you need someone to like kind of be quite self-starting, kind of go figure things out and go and not be afraid to do that. So I think that, and then of course, like looking at track record is interesting too, to see what type of challenges they've solved in the past and how do they think. And also, to be honest, it's also that kind of airplane thing. Like, if I get on a flight for 6 hours, do I want to sit next to this person, or would I rather be on a different plane? So, and I'm not saying that's everything, because like, you could end up with people. You also need to think about, like, how do you end up with people that complement what you do? It's very easy to look at candidates and be, ooh, I like them because they remind me of me. I know that sounds weird, but that's how most brains work. So how do you find people that complement your skills and your perspective? So I think that's also where we have a very structured approach to hiring, and why we have different people doing interviews, and we ask them to do cases and rate them on that. So generally it's along that field. And I think it's also like being a nice person to work with is very important, because the reality is you're going to spend a lot of time with these people, and you probably spend more time with them than you do with your family at times, which sounds, it's sad for all of us, but that's the way it is. And so, and I think it's like, also you can see also, depending on how fixed the role is, right? Because you can also see that some people can fit really well in, and they could definitely do the job, but it might not be what you need in that team composition at that point. It's but I would say the key thing to me is, like, check your own assumption and make sure that your biases might not be the right word, but like, how do you make sure that you have a hiring model that takes that into account, so it's not just so you do good decisions around hiring. But
it makes sense.
the best way of knowing it is to have worked with someone in the past, to be honest.
Yeah,
that's a bit biased, Andreas.
Yeah, I know. The best way of, because if you have worked with them, you kind of know what's going on. But you're right, and it's not all the time, of course.
To that point, there was some research, I've forgotten the source of it, but it was something that was carried out in New York at some point in a theater, where they found that the very best high performer team around setting up theater performances was to have, I think it was 30% of the staff knew each other, knew how to work with each other, and then they complemented with new skills. And if they didn't put in new people, everything would go stale. But if they moved too many of the people who knew each other, things would also fall apart. So there is a balance to hit.
All right.
We're moving on.
Yeah, I'd like to actually change the subject a little bit, because there's something we haven't talked about yet, which is very important, especially for this audience. This is CTO Craft. How should designers work with technology strategists, especially with the CTO? What should that relationship look like between technology and design? Who would like to start on this?
It should be a natural relationship. It should be... it should just work. No, it's really difficult to say, because there's always been a bit of tension in the past between design and tech, where designers have been very early up front, coming up with ideas and not really inviting tech into it. The places I've been where this has worked really, really well, and which is why I say it should be natural, is where there's been no question asked around, why are you bringing people in at the same time, and why are you working together, solving these challenges, even if you have different skill sets. So I think that thinking about how you can make it work, obviously it's really hard sometimes when you are charging, particularly in an agency, you are charging a client and you want to bring on board a team that works to solve a challenge for them, that you're also billing full time for people who are perceived not to be problem solving in the same amount of time. So you have to work at the activities that team is doing together, so that everyone can fill their time on this particular challenge. I think it's a very tricky thing to do, but to me, tech and design is really hand in hand, and it should be the case that we all are in it together from the start.
Andreas,
yeah. No, I agree. I think it's like making sure that, but also it's like, how else could you do it, right? Because like, if designs go off and build stuff that doesn't work with technology, that's not good. If tech decides what to build and then 2 years later it comes to design, that's not good either. So I guess it's also like making sure that there's a business value in this and show that this successfully, we need to be a cross-functional team that has different perspectives in early, so we can early test, de-risk, shape, and then that's kind of it. But I think it comes to that thing that I keep talking about all the time, but like deliberately designing behavior. How do we design that behavior so we make sure that that's like it leads to a clear business outcome?
Got it. Makes sense. We have another question from Mark. Can you or should you use design thinking to narrow the gap between real user behavior and wishful user behavior?
That's interesting, because what does that mean from the perspective of wishful user behavior? Is just that, it's just wishful user behavior, so it probably never happens. So I'm not sure. I get what it is. What do you think, Elin? Sorry.
Is this question about what we think a user is going to do versus what they actually are doing, and how we narrow the gap between the two?
Probably.
Yeah,
I think, yeah.
Because if it is, it's like we all have assumptions about what we think an experience needs to do for people to behave within that experience. I quite like to do a hypothesis gathering exercise early on in a project to get everything on the table. We think that people will behave this way because of this. We think they won't behave this way because of that. All the different assumptions that we have about the experience we're about to create, get them on the table, and then do some qualitative interviewing with end users to really understand if this is the case, to validate our assumptions. And based on that, I think we can narrow the gap and start designing the real things. Because very often when you go through an exercise like that in a process to investigate it after, you will discover where those gaps are. You will discover what is wishful and what is real.
Yeah, I agree. I think the only thing that I could add to that is like, how do you make that into an experiment in the real world? I had a friend who used to work with a beer company, and this beer brand was like, we do the best beer ever, and then they took a 6-pack of their beer and a 6-pack of the competitor's beer, and they put it in a park and basically said free beer. And then one brand, which wasn't theirs, got taken before anything else. So it's like interesting to put things in the real world and to see like, how do we make an experiment about this, and then what to the hypothesis, like what hypothesis can we prove or disprove, really. I think that's a key thing.
Yeah.
Okay, got it. Makes sense. So we are nearing the end. I'd like to ask you to summarize a little bit. So Elin, maybe you could start. So design thinking. I would like you also to comment on something that Andreas said earlier, which is that design thinking is more about the mindset than about the process. So in your mind, design thinking, does it actually solve challenges, or is it maybe a fad, or is it really a mindset that designers and maybe even all the stakeholders that interact with designers need to adopt?
I don't think it is a fad. I think it is something we all can align around, and it is useful in certain contexts and not every single one. I think everyone can do design thinking. It's not a magic toolkit for designers, and that's where we go wrong. We should all be involved in this process, and to me, design thinking is inviting everyone in and making everyone part of that experience it is to solve a particular problem. And when it comes to is it a step-for-step process that is foolproof? No, it isn't. If you try to take the double diamond and prescribe the activity within it in a sequence, you can come out many different ways with the same type of challenge. So I think it is up to to design leaders to use their experience and intelligence to create the right sequence of activities that can help you walk through a particular context of a problem that can lead to good results, and then work with the people that you bring into that team to align around what needs doing. So to me, it's a very flexible process. I have, though, been in environments where you've been prescribed to do things in a certain way. I don't think it works. I think you need to trust the people who are designing the actual process for the particular context of a problem. And if you can't do that, perhaps it's not going to work for you.
Andreas, do you have any comments on this? And is there also anything else you'd like to share with the audience that we haven't talked about yet?
I think there's a lot of thinking here. But I think if it's a fad, it's about an 80-year fad. So it's definitely not that. I think it's a mindset. I think it starts as a process, but then when you learn, it becomes a mindset, ideally. I think if you've tried it and it doesn't work for you, you need to apply it differently, because it's logic and common sense, and it does work. It just depends on how you shape what you do. So yeah, no, I think it's I don't really have any much more to add on that. I think it's like very, yeah, no, it does help you. It's a structured, I look at it like a modular framework for solving messy problems. And sometimes you dip into the toolbox and take the stuff that you have already done, and sometimes it's a beer experiment in a park in Germany on a sunny day. It depends.
Yep. All right. So my last question is, how can people get hold of you?
LinkedIn is a good way. I don't know if you make my email address available. You can email me. I'm on Instagram, Elineska. I don't really use Twitter that much. So best way, email me or reach out on LinkedIn.
I would echo the LinkedIn sentiment. I'm trying to detoxify from all the other channels, but LinkedIn is a good place to start.
Fantastic. I've just posted the links to your LinkedIn profiles and my own. So thank you, Elin and Andreas, for talking with us today. Just like we said, you can connect with the speakers using the links in the chat. I'd like to thank you all for joining, and please subscribe to our newsletters to find out more about events like this one. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.